Awesome.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, it's going to be, at least in my opinion, I think it's probably more you guys and I'll help, right? Like I'm trying to explore the current state. I've been around metagame for a long time in the sense that I was kind of hanging out and contributing a bit pretty early on,
For sure.
but because I'm like running a company and have a small child, like I really kind of was fading into patron status. But
100%.
I still want to be able to like help if I can, so I definitely need like a little bit of a sort of primer, get an understanding of what you guys see as the stakeholder groups' value propositions, like how what you're creating is sort of connecting to your internal teams
Yeah.
versus how it might affect people, beyond the scope of the players. Kind of, I'm reading through the doc by the way while we chat. I'm trying to do a little bit of orientation so that I'm like not just telling you to do stuff, but like thinking about what you're trying to accomplish and for whom.
Yeah. Because I think I, I get what you're saying there. Because a lot of people coming, or even recently, people who are super talented have you know domain expertise, and the idea being that they need something to latch onto, or a project within metagame which they can kind of apply their skill set or their perspective to. And obviously this seemed like the perfect place for yourself, because we know this is something we have to fix if we want to make this community actually like sustainable. We need some stability within the seed economy. And um, what we've been looking at recently is just the fact that we have a lot of supply side pressure, so a lot of cash
Mm-hmm.
outflow, and we
Yep.
now need to incentivize demand. So we need to put some more features within the seed economy to create to marry that other side and create more buy pressure to create stability within the seed economy as we go about working on public goods and the
Right.
commons. And what you'll see on the Figma obviously is just ideas. So
Mm-hmm.
currently we've looked at a couple of economies. We've looked at how, well, I have personally looked at how Axes kind of run their circular economy, or their situation. We've looked at Olympus DAO and their bonding mechanism,
Mm-hmm.
which seems super interesting because they've got great treasury growth. And even in moments when the treasury seems to decrease, the growth of the amount of users or people who get involved in Olympus DAO is ever increasing, and that's really interesting to me in particular as well. Uh,
Right.
Past that, we looked at India Stack, because India Stack is something which I feel not many Western economies kind of do, and it's the future of this whole. I don't really know how to explain it, but it's a super interesting concept, and really looking at comparing what they do in India compared to what we can do in metagame to create this almost cloud nation or cloud city which caters to
Yeah.
all these different
Th-
aspects.
This isn't as uncommon as you think. It's just that it's not articulated this way. I feel like a lot of people discover the necessity of all of these components
Mm-hmm.
without necessarily approaching it like it's a stack. So
Yeah.
like when I'm looking at the what you're seeing in this sort of um, like what you have under metagame under ecosystem on the far right, I'm looking at the sort of relationship between ceramic and say let's say Ethereum as the blockchain or an L2 or something that you would use to keep the transaction costs down.
Mm-hmm.
There's already a decent amount of crossover between something like IPFS and Ceramic because Ceramic is basically a kind of document database where the documents are content addressed.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about, say, that grouping here, like something like Ceramic, Ethereum, and IPFS, is that sort of collectively you get three levels of structuredness in your
Yeah.
data. So IPFS will be like the naming convention and allows you to do sort of local flat file storage, which you can later prove that you have exactly the thing you had before. So in a way, it's storage without storage if you
Yeah.
use IPFS in its like most basic form. It's again, content addressable naming is almost like storage without storage. I've joked with people that one of the best things about IPFS is that I could send you an IPFS hash and mail you a flash drive with a file on it, and you can still get it and cryptographically prove that I sent you the thing I was supposed to send you. Anyway,
It's pretty wild.
uh,
I love
uh,
IP.
That's awesome.
anyway, yeah, I'm a big fan. Anyway, yeah, actually, one of my former students is economics lead at Filecoin. It's pretty
Wow.
nuts. The world
Okay.
is like crazy. He's fucking brilliant. Anyway, yeah. So okay, so just like starting with that little bit there, and obviously that has very little to do with the tokenomics. That has to do with sort of. Well, it has to do with tokenomics, but it's like a value production layer, especially if you're producing like, actual content, like things.
Yeah.
You need something often more than just a blockchain, which tends to carry really, really blockchains. They're able to carry metadata, and so when you think about it, ceramic and IPFS are critical components for carrying data. And you need that data to be representative of more complex things that you're building, or even like, interfaces to the stuff that's happening in the real world.
Sure.
So assuming that you have, work on this, I'm gonna just focus on that triad for the moment. Then you can start to think about the value you're producing in terms of the artifacts that have at least some sort of, we'll call them cryptographic pointers, which create a sort of a sense of mass, or like, there's a thing there to anchor to. So basically, you can be sort of measuring, and I know source cred fills a critical role in the stack for creating measurement of contribution data, but that's also not necessarily the same as production. It's almost complementary. You're like, here's what we did, and here's what we made, if that makes sense.
I think that lends its hand to the ideas surrounding, or recent ideas about like my meta. So I see my meta has potential to be almost like a reputation layer, where we look at people or players and the data that they can provide. For instance, if we, well, as I move closer to the center of that document, you'll see here we have like my meta LP gated access DAO index, and we talked about creating almost a layer on DAO space which encompasses various different psychometrics, almost similar to Ray Dalio and his assessment centers for Bridgewater Associates, where he looks at all these different metrics for individual players and pursuing the idea of radical transparency. So I'm talking Myers-Briggs, team dimension tests, golden personality profilers, all these types of things. And then because it's crypto, the ability to have radical transparency, but also the ability to have radical privacy. So being able to choose the amount of visibility you have and what you choose to show within your profile, that's kind of where I see my message being great.
Yeah.
And
so can I ask a few more questions, kind of zooming in on this part? So one, I think is really cool. The idea to give agency over the range, the privacy, sort of spectrum is actually really powerful, because I personally am a little more on the transparency side most of the time, and I like it that way. But I can sort of, obviously, like, I don't take pictures of my 1-year-old and put them on the internet for a reason, because fucking facial recognition and who knows what, and I just feel a little weird about it. So the fact that on one hand I'm like, I'm speaking publicly and open sourcing everything, blah blah blah, but then right. So just to be clear, like, that's awesome. That providing that, and again, not that things should be private or transparent, but rather that that's contextual, and you giving people or even communities more control over where they fall in that space. But the thing I wanted to hone in on there is, what the stuff that you're producing, is it, do you envision it as for the consumption of the metagame, or for consumption of other communities using some of the tooling that, essentially, is it equipment for other communities, or is it equipment for metagame itself?
For everybody, I like how I see my meta is, in an instance, is you'll have the DAO space, mapped with all these different psychometric factors and all the different players, etc., giving more context to what source cred produces. And the idea almost being that somebody, if they're interested in Web3, the public goods or the commons, can literally create a profile on my meta, and they'll also be able to see how aligned they are with different communities. So almost like a sorting hat, it will be able to show
Right.
you which DAOs are going to be best suited to your personality type and the things that kind of like sing to you.
Gotcha. Okay, that
That's
makes
what
sense.
it's.
So
Yeah.
one thing though I want to highlight about that is that um, that there's a lot of loosely overlapping efforts to accomplish this kind of thing. So,
Yeah.
like for example, one project which is not tokenized, it's just like more like sort of directly funded and bootstrapped, is trying to build something like a link tree, which has got a little overlap with some
Yeah.
of the pages, the profile pages that MetaGame's been working on. But I would say that they're, I mean, a little bit more, there's a difference in the target audience and the
Yeah.
target use, but the overlap is the ability to produce what is effectively scraped achievements. Because if you want to be able to do this kind of personality test, you're going to need to be able to build, you know, data collection and sort of cleaning infrastructure for not just even the Ethereum blockchain, but a number of data sources. Like if people choose, or like say we don't want to dox people, so they opt in and they say, well, I'm this person, you know, here are some addresses that belong to me, and you're able to sort of scrape and interpret that and transform that data into the format which is the input into your, you know, basically psychometrics,
Yeah.
and that like results in some sort of, you know, recommendations, or in a way I'm sort of envisioning from what you said a kind of recommendation engine for communities. Like you
Yeah.
do certain things, contribute to certain projects in certain ways, or you have certain activities on your public addresses, and insofar as someone sort of opts into, you know, giving, you know, saying, hey, I'm this person, look at what I've been doing, or providing other optional data, you'd basically be in a position to make recommendations to them about where to go get involved, and even, you know, potentially have that go in both directions. Because I know as a like person
Yeah.
running projects that it can be really hard also. Like there's a big difference between people who want to contribute and
Yeah.
people who actually fit. Like the fitness can go both ways. Like
Yeah.
even DAOs need to understand like which people have the skills and the values and whatnot, because you do see mismatches in both directions,
All the
leading
time.
to fractures and frustrations and loss of efficiency, depending on, you know, your perspective. The people get frustrated, but also the organization can sputter.
Yeah. Well, I think we've experienced so much of that, and it's not uncommon in communities. I was speaking to people recently about, I think it was sushi. They had almost like I think the Phantom Troop. It was like this big proposal about getting these like name brand investors to invest into sushi, and it kind of split the community down the middle. And there was a bit of a ruckus in regards to people who are on board, people who are off board with it, and you do find those moments within these communities where that happens. And even like recently with us, I think a lot of the problems we've had is, especially with our innkeepers, for instance, they're like the oil to the whole metagame system, but they're finding themselves very frustrated where they're putting tons of time into meeting and greeting people and telling them the same thing consistently, and these people sometimes are just not ready for the DAO space, or they're not ready to join
Right.
metagame because I don't know. Maybe they got a busy job.
Well,
Maybe got a busy
to be honest with
business.
you, that there probably needs to be a like richer funnel, like something where it's not as simple as just sort of meeting and greeting and answering the same questions. You might have to have a set of compartments. Like there's an initial little like initial meet and greet where you
Yeah,
kind of have your innkeepers bundle people into groups, and then have somewhat specialized people within that team who go into the different groups. And like if it's one group that needs more education versus one group that's ready to get going and contribute, or again, like sort of have a defined funnel, have the top of the funnel be a sorting exercise, and then try to give people, you know, something closer fit to them. Because there's a sort of tendency in the crypto space to sort of overdo the everybody's the same thing. Don't get
yeah,
me wrong, like I think everybody's valuable, like we should, attempt to help people, but like everybody's also different.
For sure.
And so like some people might not be a good fit, not because go away, but because they're not interested in the same sort of kind of thing, or maybe they're just not ready and you need to teach them, or maybe ... But like there are real variations in the population in terms of values and norms, in terms of technical skills and experience, in terms of willingness to learn new things. Like if you don't like acknowledge those differences, you end up with almost as many problems as you do if like the point is just that like acknowledge them, plan for them, deal with them, as opposed to sort of assume that, hey, it's Web3, so everyone's the same. It's like the same in the sense that they should be valued and appreciated, yada yada, but not necessarily the same in sort of attributes or expectations.
Okay. Do you reckon that means then we need to focus on almost recruiting for the current phase that we're in? Like at this current moment in time, we're building like the foundations. It's like a lot of people have said we're building as we're flying on this like plane to wherever we're going. And with that in mind, then we maybe need to take more of a like you said, more of a detailed approach in regards to who we actually want to introduce to the community and be a part of it.
I
And
think that's true, especially just to tie it into some of your self pressure thing. And I'm not sure that this is the case, but like source cred, one of its challenges is that like the honestly like the praise bot and the TEC and any like socially driven measurement system, it always has the capacity to pick up things that like we'll say they read as productivity even when they're not moving you towards your goal. Is just like lots of back and forth or constructing things, like sometimes bike shedding type outcomes. And I'm not saying that you should carve all of that stuff out, because a lot of times it's important exploratory work that's value hasn't been proven yet, but you can like kind of get a sense of how much of your cred production is tied to and actually I think we talked about this like some long time ago with Hamad and whatever. The idea that like you might need to do cred budgeting a little bit and say like, okay, we're gonna put some fraction of the total cred we're releasing into these like clear development initiatives, and then like some fraction of the cred into sort of the community management and like administrative stewardship, like support labor, and then maybe some other fraction into stuff that's more like exploratory, whatever. And in doing so, avoid maybe providing too much cred and minting too much grain, vis-a-vis whatever the token is, into like essentially just into the market without clear value proposition to the organization as a group. It's tricky because that's all policy making. So until you have some notion of governance over things like cred budgeting or cred parameters, it's really easy for someone always to say like, well, hey, why are we undervaluing the thing I'm doing or the thing that me and my collaborators are doing? So I'm emphasizing this less as a go do this and more as a like having formal governance over the cred parameterization, including cred budgeting across sort of sectors or across seed vectors. If you understand how source cred works, it's actually a PageRank variant. So there's a couple different ways to do this, but ultimately, like a little bit of intentional budgeting can help drive the incentives at the core initiatives and make it less likely that the token is sort of being minted. It just tries to align the token minting, which is tied to the measurement, which should be tied to the outcomes, and the feedback loop that you should be looking to close from that perspective is one where the community perceives the cred as a good enough proxy for like labor which pushes the project in the direction it's trying to go. If you perceive the project as not pushing fast enough, or not maybe fast enough, but like in the right direction, then the cred budgeting is part of the tool, and the parameters of cred are part of the tool that you would govern to literally steer the ship. And so understanding that a DAO is like a boat, but it's a boat made of people. Like there's a quote I love from a song by Watsky called "We live in a house made of each other, and if that sounds strange, that's because it is." And I've always thought of DAOs as boats made of each other, where we're trying to steer.
That was really cool. Great insight again. That's awesome. Past that, I guess, in regards to, I guess, steering the ship and source cred in general, I think one of the things that I was talking to a couple of people about is, you know, we have different types of players. There's players that kind of do a lot of work, and there's other players, I don't know, DAO work or metagame work. There's other players who do work, but it's in a very different context. And source cred has the ability to obviously to value that in a way. So, you know, there's certain players who they offer more of like a social value to the community, where they, you know, they're here to talk, but people come back to hear them and listen to their perspective, and it keeps people engaged with the community.
Yeah.
And I think there's actually a huge value to that. And currently, maybe in our
that is so incredibly important. What I'm trying to get at is that source cred and the tooling in general can only allow you to represent what you want. So when I was talking about the budgeting thing, I'm not saying exclude that stuff. I'm saying be more explicit about it. Say, these are things that we see and as mattering to our DAO. Here is how we are supporting them. And I don't know what the breakdowns should be, but by making it more explicit and by like engaging with the community to try to understand how to, like, think, and I'm going to use a different analogy, but like if you think of this as building a kind of community center, you like figure out what rooms you actually need, right? Like, and if that room is an important room, this like, you know, community, you know, like, I don't know, like hangout, water coolers, couches, / whiteboard in the front, / projector, / movie night, / whatever the hell it is that people are doing and we feel like brings value to the community, make sure that room's there, put a sign that says, the room is over there, and like, you know, these are the behaviors expected here, and here's how we measure and value that. And in a way, making the measurement, which is what source credit is, more legible and actually being clear about what it's being used for can actually help. And again, I'm not trying to tell you what your, you know, cred budgeting or parameters should be, but I'm definitely not telling you to neglect that stuff. I'm actually saying, like, take time to understand it, how it all fits together to make up the organization. And what you start to have is think of it as not so much of an org chart as an org graph. Like, the different pieces aren't like beholden to each other in the sense of a hierarchy of an org chart, but there's still like a structural relationship between the components of that organization, and bringing some legibility to it can actually help people find the right space to spend time in, understand the value that's being created, understand how they're sharing in it. And so then you start to have a space where I think that, you know, again, this is the production side of your token, the cred and cred budgeting and cred parameterization starts to like feel right, and hopefully you can get on the right heading. I am going to point out that, you know, we haven't addressed at all the sell pressure side yet, and I think one thing that you could do that's comparatively low hanging fruit is go out and do some effort to make it possible to borrow or lend, or like find a way to give people the option to basically take funds to spend for their day-to-day lives, for their costs, but potentially to do it in a way that doesn't apply quite as much sell pressure. That's not a whole solution in and of itself, but when I you know, dealing with people building for example, granting programs, one of the things I always tell them is don't just give them your token, give them a mechanism for which to cover their expenses. Because if you're giving people grants to do something, like, if grants tend to be, unfortunately, a little bit of a squeeze. They're not usually big enough for people to really, I mean, not that there never are, but more often than not, you see projects being like, oh, well, you need, you know, $5,000 worth of, you know, my token, and they're like, and at the spot price, and people are like, oh no, I have to sell it right now because just barely, you know, if it goes down, I won't even be able to cover my expenses. But like, I tend to advocate for giving people, you know, whatever their bid expenses are in, you know, if possible, in stablecoin, and giving them oh, I see, yeah, sorry, I just saw the circling, and give them their token is more of upside. like understanding the difference between, in this case, seeds being like they're your investment in your community.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily mean investment in the sense that the token goes up, though it also can mean that. I mean investment in the sense that just holding it is a membership badge, like literally in the case of metagame. You hold seeds to be like, look, like I'm a metagamer, right?
Sure.
And so it doesn't matter at some level whether they go up or down, because that's part of an identity that you're creating for yourself. Whereas the the necessity to pay for your living expenses, and the real possibility of moving into a world where Web3 can sustain your rent and your food and whatnot is pretty incredible. And I think a lot of people here are really excited about that. We do have to like separate those two use cases. They are not the same thing. We might end up using the same tool or some parts of the same tool to meet them, but this idea of like, let's call it the financial living constraint. Just like, what do I need to feel reliable? Like I need it to be reliable. I sort of want to be able to focus on work on that I care about, while at the same time having a reliable source of income, so that I don't have to worry about that externally, so that I can do my work, hang out with my community. That use case is not the same as the one there you say, hey, this is part of my identity. It's not the same as the use case where you say, hey, I expect this number to go up and potentially make me rich. And again, like that last one is always going to be really fuzzy. Like you shouldn't ever have to rely on it. If you have to rely on it, I usually think that's kind of hollow. It's possible, but like if that's the value proposition, you're already in risky territory.
I hear that. I think it's funny you say, because I think with all the different individuals, we all come from different frameworks and perspectives in regards to how we think about metagame, and there is that almost sense of like there's an altruistic framework where we kind of see things for what this could be, access to opportunity for people who have access to the internet and these relevant apps and all this different type of stuff. But there's a subgroup of people within metagame who are active, who actually need this system financialized a little bit more, so that we can offer ourselves stability to continue working and building this community out. That's what's actually very important. So even coming up in the next literally day or so, I've got a proposal that will be coming out in regards to the treasury. So we have some interest from some other communities who kind of looking to partner with us. We have Reflexer Finance or Reflexer Labs, and also Babylon Finance, who do like community-led asset management. And it was almost like the perfect storm that's kind of happened, where we have one community who kind of wants to invest into our community as a whole, because we're building for public good. So for every DAO in this space, or for any project that exists in the Web3 space, we're building for them. But at the same time, we have to try and make use of our treasury to to make some down money so that we can fund the people work.
I think partnerships is also really good. So let me make a few points. The DAO space is very like nascent in a lot of ways, but it also is growing kind of differently, in the sense that it really is network driven, right? So like there are people who are in multiple orgs, but there's also ideas that can flow across orgs in a way that like the sort of corporate style or even government style social architecture doesn't do very well, because there's a degree to which key ideas or functional specializations, or sort of there's a higher degree of, I would say, like low friction or low transaction costs between groups. So in a, people talk about the theory of the firm, and they talk about firms arising because to reduce transaction costs. It's pretty basic stuff. It's like 60s coast stuff. But if you start examining the world from that lens, you realize that there's lots of ways and lots of contexts in which you can reduce transaction costs. And one of the things that's cool about DAOs is that they're not just reducing transaction costs in the sort of within this sort of squad or group, but they can also through certain norms, at least in some integrations, significantly reduce transaction costs between groups, which enables some degree of specialization, which increases efficiency. So in a way, you can almost think of it like I'm going to call it kind of a community of communities, but what I really mean is if you take like the tribe analogy where, you've got a group of people and they start to specialize. Now, what we're doing is getting something that looks like a tribe of tribes where there's some aspects that every person or every tribe needs to be able to do, but there are other things that they don't have to because they have essentially network edges to other tribes which have complementary specializations. And so starting to understand that this is actually one of the novel components of the DAO space means that just because you've recognized a functional gap in your sustainability doesn't mean that you have to fill it yourself. Sometimes the best path is to sort of partner at the sort of DAO to DAO level. And that's something that I've actually been doing a good chunk of research with the Curve Labs folks. And like there's other people who are interested in, tokenomics as a piece of emerging organizational design and the relationships between the sort of political decisions and the economic decisions and the sort of rewiring that makes it possible to achieve things that maybe we haven't succeeded with so much in our social and economic systems. And all said, that's experimentation. But from your point about like integrating and collaborating, I think that's actually a really good way to approach things. And actually, I'm a pretty big fan of the RAI system. I think it's a good approach to the sort of not quite stable coin, right? Where you have a token which is not strictly pegged to the dollar, but it retains some of the core like things you need from a currency, like a certain like reliability in what it's going to be worth without strictly say pegging to USD.
For sure. I think that's one of the big things that actually made me quite excited about them reaching out to us like via Bacon, one of our players here, or no, Patron, who kind of set this thing up and kind of taking a deeper look into the whole ecosystem that they have there. It was like, oh right, no, this makes perfect sense. And there's a lot of different communities which I think we have a natural, or could potentially have like a very natural like connection to, or synergy with. And a case of reaching out to them and making this ecosystem kind of grow via partnerships is for me, it's one of the low-hanging fruits for getting us to where we need to get to anyway, and at least buy us some time as we look to build out our credit markets and all these other things. In my head, the tokenomic situation is all about looking at the seed at the center of the economy and looking at what functions are needed to create a better economy.
Let me screen share something for you. I want to chat about it's. I'm gonna see if this is legible. Okay. So that's Gitcoin. Here we go. Right, no, that's a different thing. Can you see my screen? Okay.
Yeah. I'm screen recording. We're watching this right now.
So this is going to be part of a extensive like forum post for Gitcoin actually that I've been writing, and it's been taking forever because it's a bunch of text to go with it too. But but anyway, because we're talking about mappings and like tokens, like so this is what the Gitcoin economy looks like at a high level, like the political economy. Yeah. I won't go over it too much, but basically you've got grant owners and grant donors, of which many of us are both. You've got paid contributors and volunteer contributors, and according to my definitions, you can actually be both at the same time if you're getting paid to do some work, but you're volunteering to do other work, or you're contributing in a meaningful, non-paid way. And then, of course, the center of this is the stewards, and the stewards are, essentially delegates from the token holders, and the token holders are like a reasonably good proxy, at least for the time being, for these other types of contributors because of the way that the drop took place. Now, obviously, there's a lot of capacity for these things to decouple, and it does matter what the distribution of the token drop was, but effectively in any token voting system, you're relying on the token serving as a proxy for the body of contributors. Yeah. Which also goes back to our discussion earlier about who's holding versus or delegating even versus who needs to cash out, say,
Sure.
like, again, there's this perpetuity in any token system that you got to watch out for, where someone who's better off financially is not only less needing to get paid, but if they do get paid, they're more likely to be able to use that to exert influence rather
Yeah.
than having to just say sell it and use the funds to
100%. Yeah.
live their life. But kind of just getting a quick snapshot of like what you're like, sort of what I'm calling here the sort of stakeholder, organizational value flows. You can kind of see how power and decision making works in a DAO if you just kind of try to map the stakeholders and look at their relationships to each other.
Yeah.
This one is something closer to what we were just talking about. Is a functional map. Functional maps are useful because they start to ask what must be done. So these boxes aren't necessarily groups of people. They're functions that must be fulfilled by working groups, by contributors. I might change some wording on it to make that clear. Actually, that's the main thing I've been doing. I was supposed to post this like a week ago, and I'm stuck on words because I don't want the words to create the opposite of the intended interpretation. But the truth is that what we're trying to figure out is what makes the DAO function. Like, it provides an important public good, a platform for funding public goods, but at the same time, its components aren't just show up and support funding public goods. You need to figure out what technical and social work is required, right? What does it take to manifest Gitcoin? And now that Gitcoin's a DAO, it's actually kind of important that we figure out, almost as if it were, a Web 2 company, where you have a bunch of teams that do a bunch of things, except for, unlike a Web 2 company where there's some hierarchy and someone saying, you have to do this, you have this sort of community of communities, but even inside of the DAO itself, right? So it's not like we were just discussing between DAOs. The reason I pulled this up is because it's, in a way, it's going to manifest as almost sub-DAOs or groups that are codependent on each other within the organization with the shared goal of manifesting and maintaining and protecting the thing that DAO creates. And so, our kind of rough first pass at this is to say, like, look, a lot of things revolve around platform operations, but as it turns out, there's a small group that's responsible for, administering treasury management decisions. There's always going to be this communication and community management component. I've been really working hard for the last few months, actually since the beginning of the year, to slowly grow what is effectively a data science centric sub DAO that can do the Sybil resistance and collusion detection, because quadratic funding is actually very susceptible to certain kinds of attacks, but it's part of the identity of Gitcoin, or of Gitcoin grants. And so if we want to be able to do quadratic funding, we have to be prepared to do the ongoing, data science work and to build up the sort of fraud detection infrastructure, which, again, like, these kinds of things have been done in a centralized setting. You've got credit card companies, you've got these entities that have large teams of both, model builders and maintainers and researchers whose job is to make sure that, fraud doesn't undermine the system. But, like, somehow we need to build that skill, that capability, shared knowledge, tools, automations, blah, blah, blah. And so what are we trying to do? Well, we don't want that to be, synonymous with the rest of the DAO because it's specialized and it's a function. But on the other hand, it needs to be beholden to and provide outputs to. So this ecology that we're talking about with interdependencies arises pretty naturally. For example, in the little triad here between, platform operations, fraud detection and defense, and sort of stewards who are policy making. And so, I'll stop now. But I mean, the point I'm trying to get at here is that you guys are talking about the right things. I think that it might even help you to start to, like, back out what your sort of functional requirements for your organization are. Not functional requirements for the software, but functional requirements for the organization, how they interrelate, and then just sort of like ask, how are they getting accomplished and what do we need? And sometimes the answer might be, we're partnering with reflexor labs because we need, cleaner access to, stable currency in order to enable our contributors to sort of cash out. But we also, again, that doesn't directly fix sell pressure. So, I think we should probably shift the conversation to, we have other stuff we can talk about, I guess.
Okay.
But I think the main outstanding thing we haven't sort of redressed is, if you have steady sell pressure and your token value is going down, or your, reserves are getting depleted, that's a sort of runway. And I think, accomplishing sustainability is about getting to a point where it seems like on a month-to-month basis that you can ineffectively wash out, that you can work, see the work as valuable. You can mint the new seeds according to the economic policies that you have set, that the new seeds can be distributed in such a way that, again, for me, like, ideal is actually things stay relatively constant. There can be circumstances when there's like, big successful outcome, and maybe that drives new attention, and maybe that drives your token price up, or there's things that can do that. But I would generally view, things in terms of a dynamic equilibrium where the labor, the production that labor gives rise to, and the community, and all of the interfaces to the external financial system, for starters, just kind of wash out. That you're not depleting, but rather you're, if you were running a small company like I do, that's the moment when your P&L just starts to balance out. And from my perspective, running a small research company, the truth is that, like, all I really want to do is make sure that everybody who's contributing is getting compensated fairly, and that we're all getting to do cool stuff we like to do, and that the financials beyond that are just risk hedging, not not moon.
Yeah. Totally hear that. Yeah. It's about the stability, and I think a lot of people have commented on that. Is like certain tokenomic ecosystems you see. I think, for instance, I've taken part in some economies such as like Step Finance on Solana or Walt Finance, and they had like these like ridiculous emissions, right, where you could get these super high APRs or APYs in a short space of time, where you're almost making like 10% on your capital invested within 3 to 4, 5 days, or if not a week. And it kind of lends its hand to, pump and dumps, where people, they invest for a short period of time, and then all that capital they take from that economy, and it disappears.
They bring it,
never comes back.
They go to the next thing that they can find. Yeah, I mean, it's super common in crypto, and I think one of the problems that we have is that we still, and again, there are reasons for this, but people attribute success to that. Yeah. Even like the idea of success, they're like, "Oh, wow," and you're like, "Yeah, but like what did you really do? Like, again, and this is normative. I'm very much like here for the the ecology of crypto. Like, I dealt with multi-agent systems since the early 2000s. I worked on I did some civil and environmental engineering stuff as an undergraduate, got into robotics and started doing multi-agent robotics and coordination and dynamic resource allocation and networks. And I spent way too many years probably in school, but I did a mixture of consulting and businesses and dynamic, basically algorithm design for resource allocation. But that means that, like, what's exciting for me about crypto is the capacity to do something other than what you just described. So the number of times that people do that and claim success, I'm just kind of like, cool, but also that's not new. That's just the traditional finance system on fast mode.
Yeah, big time. That's an interesting perspective, the current ecosystem on fast mode. It makes me think, like, honestly, about, okay, well, if we are trying to replicate maybe a more sustainable ecosystem, what are the key things you think we need to address? Is it a case of if we are going to offer some form of emissions or interest on things which are state bonded or provided for in terms of liquidity, do we basically need to just reduce the emissions, so taking the economy and putting it on a slow mode? or do we
I
need to
think
add other
slower
things?
is better, but I wouldn't. I like intuitively. I like things to go slower if you're trying to get them to be sustainable. That's not entirely true. I like them to be what I would call like distributed in speed. So you'll have some things that are fast and some things that are medium and some things that are slow. You can kind of
Okay.
imagine
All right.
the process time cycles as being spread out, where things like we talked before about possibly governing the budgeting and or cred weights to sort of try to steer the boat. That generally
Yeah.
that's very slow. Something that's the some of the financial parameters might be something that you could tweak a little faster, but I do agree that emissions, too much emissions is going to kind of lend itself to that fast mode problem. So rather than think about how much emissions is good or bad, like sort of just in advance,
Yeah.
what you really want to look at is what for purpose they're fulfilling. So in a lot of crypto economic systems, their purpose is they're essentially think of it like advertising. You spend a whole bunch of money, a bunch of people hit the top of your funnel, most of them churn, some is left over, and if the amount of leftover, let's just say like users that you got from that process is valuable enough to offset what it cost you through the emissions, then you succeeded. So like if you start to think in that paradigm, then you're realizing that you're doing it to bring in more users, to bring in more use. Then if you're not in a place where what you want is a ton of people hitting your token, then you're really not. I'm not sure that it fills a need that you
No.
have.
Yeah.
So I would advocate instead for looking at the needs that you have. So in this case, that first order need is just making sure that there's a way for people who need to spend some of their seeds to cover expenses can do so in a way that's like minimally invasive for the community as a whole and allows them to sort of not be creating this downward pressure. And I think that means of lending your seeds for yield is not a bad way to do that,
Yeah.
but also being able to figure out how to make that work from a stablecoin integration perspective, because it's not just that they want to lend their seeds and get yield, it's that they need to find mechanisms through which they can sort of turn their seed holdings into a sustainable sort of revenue stream that they
Yeah.
can use to cover their rent. And so the workflow or the use case means I take seeds, I put them somewhere, those seeds yield something that I can use in order to cash out. And again, that conversion from seeds to stable coins is also a really tricky part there, because what you want them doing is or what they would want to be doing here is getting the stable coins so they can sort of cash out and pay their rent, buy their food, while not losing their exposure to or their sort of membership sense of holding seeds, or at least even if they're lending them or otherwise staking them in something, so they can retain that identity even if they're kind of drawing against it to
Yeah.
pay their rent. And you still have to look at the time scales over which that's sustainable, because if we're talking about people's um, you know their living expenses, that's a very, very different set of economic incentives from spiky returns. You'd much rather have a reliable steady amount to just be like, okay, well, I'm going to get about this much each month, then I'm going to be able to use it to cover my expenses. Now I can focus on doing all the cool things I want to do, rather than something where you're hunting for these 5 days worth of crazy yields. It's not just a different mental model, it's an entirely different behavior. You have to spend a lot of your effort just hunting for and networking for those leads if you want to be in sort of spike after spike after spike. And
Yeah.
I'm the first person to say, like, I don't really waste my time with that.
No.
It's not really a waste of time. I could probably get very wealthy if I just use my network to run around and hunt for all the high yield 3 to 7 day spikes
Yeah.
and just like move my money between them. And I think a lot of people have done very well doing that, but it's not particularly productive. To our
No.
earlier discussion, that just kind of like the old economy on fast mode. You're running around doing that and you're not actually making anything new.
Exactly. I think like I think a lot of the conversations we've had previously as well is like, okay, well, metagame, the size of our current economy is, X amount, and you can look at SafeMoon, Dogecoin, Shiba, and all these other, tokenomic ecosystems, and look at how much value has been placed on those within those contexts. And what I think people don't realize is that we're trying to do something which is, I wouldn't say it's a polar opposite of where that is, but we're providing a totally different value to what that is. It's past just purely like, I think what they call it, like value accrual tokenomics, where you're just looking for the token to be worth whatever. This is more altruistic, but it isn't getting it's not getting as much attention because it isn't about this whole, get rich quick.
So here's the gap, though. The gap is in measurement. So the reason that you just listed those off, because they have large market caps, or they generated huge yields, or there's a lot of quote unquote value captured or value sort of represented, and they're largely sort of market cap or financial metric driven. Yeah. And part of the reason why that happens is because financial metrics are easy to measure and they're easy to compare, and very much the you get what you measure thing is at play here. And so one of the things I like about metagame is all of the experimentation. And I actually first got involved when I was working on source credit a bit in 2019. And so metagame was one of the earliest sort of hackers using it, being like, all right, how are we going to use this measurement system to make something better? And so that the thing you have to understand is that source credit itself is a lower level measurement tool at the sense that it's a component, whereas metagame is sort of almost like a measurement system. You start looking at your profiles, my meta, you look at the set of things that you guys seem to be building, at least from my perspective. They represent a gestalt of measurement tools, which I think can help make TVL only measures legible for people, and that we can have people engage and get behind making some other measurements or set of measurements go up besides just token price or besides just APY. And that doesn't mean ignore token price and APY. It means treat them more as tools to make it sustainable, tools to make sure that your team members are supported or that your community members are supported, right? They don't go away. They're just equipment that you use to create that sustainability, but the numbers that you want to go up are numbers you don't know what they are yet. And you're still kind of building out the infrastructure for measurement for a community to steer against that is exciting and legible and memeable, and somehow you're kind of trying to, and I say trying because I know we're not quite there yet, get to a point where these other value systems and measurements that support those value systems can be sufficiently standardized and codified. And again, standardized up to parameters so that people have the ability to kind of steer, literally, right? Even if there's some need to do re-steering every month or 3 months or whatever, this is the slow mode, right? Once you acknowledge that things like the cred budgeting that we were talking about, minting rates are any number of things become community policy making, you need to have machinery in place for people to participate in that. And although I'm always pretty skeptical of token weighted voting machines as solutions to problems, because the joke is that the mechanism is a very small part, really not joke, small part of the decision making process. It's still something that you need some sort of mechanism. I actually think that because of the way metagame works, you could do a mixture of token voting and player voting, where because you have hard rolls, and it's pretty difficult to earn them. It's significant. It's hard enough to contribute enough to gain roles and to be an active player that, the Sybil threat's pretty small, especially if you do Bright ID or Idena or Proof of Humanity integrations for, player IDs. You could probably make a nice mix of sort of token weighted and basically player one person one vote type voting to strike a balance between to strike a balance in terms of voting procedures, and like sort of use that to manage your organization level decision making. And it could be as simple as setting the minting rates and setting the cred budgets, and that could be as something that you only do periodically. But if you did it like every 3 months, you might suppose that you used a seed weighted component, then you'd probably want to lock up some of the seeds for the voting period, to prevent people from just like running to the market and buying a bunch and then dumping them right after the vote. But a lot of that, you can figure it out. It just depends on some of the structuring, time scaling, and that could also create some demand. Again, careful with token voting, because the demand it creates looks like people with money go buy lots of tokens and then they steer all of the decision making. A nice example of at least a check against that is in OneHive. We have the community covenant and the sort of override for token votes, where if the token vote passed is perceived as sort of against the mission, vision, values of the community, against the covenant, which is pretty general. It's mostly mission, vision, valuesy. Then someone can challenge it, and it goes to a court, and the court is Celeste is a Aragon Courts fork, I think, which is itself, I think, a fork of what's it called? Wow, I'm blanking. I need to drink more coffee. Claros. Anyway, point is that like there's a little bit of organizational design that happens there, and my gut is that for metagame, the way that its value system works, that you'd be better off sort of spending a little bit of time with that like organizational mapping, lists of stakeholder groups and what they need, both internal and external, contributors of various types, looking at where those vulnerabilities are. In this case, the vulnerability seems to arise from certain people who need to cover their day-to-day expenses, then kind of look at how to shore up those vulnerabilities and create sustainability. But at this point, it's really more about the organization and the mixture of productive labor value flows, value created flows, and token flows, all on the same level. Not like money is up here and then the other stuff. You put those three things together and look at how to balance them out, and that'll lead you to something more likely to be sustainable. But often that could be at the expense of doing what I would consider the suboptimal thing, but that sort of short-term burst of yield comes from this other thing we talked about before, and I tend to see that as, at best orthogonal to this kind of sustainability, and at worst counterproductive.
Yeah. Okay. You feel like you answered so many questions. This is awesome.
I mean, I do this like all the time. This is like my job, actually, is to like try to, because my self-chosen job, which is like to run a research company that works on a mixture of mechanism and organizational design, and some actual more computer sciencey research with some of my team members. But we've been doing the thing that we're talking about now, oh my God, for fuck's sake, please stop doing the whatever pump thing and try to help people design sustainable economics and ecosystems for their communities and products and whatever. It's actually kind of refreshing that in the last year or so, with the big spike in sort of awareness of DAOs and discussions of squads and whatnot, it's actually becoming easier because more people have the language for it. Like 3 years ago, like this conversation would take me 3 weeks because people weren't like the people I was talking to hadn't thought about it that much yet, or the narratives weren't out there yet, and like so we didn't even have the words in common to talk about it.
Squad wealth and all them things, some of those simple keywords which we kind of all can get behind and understand in a simplistic way. I think in cryptocurrency we have an actual issue with jargon. Like we have a lot of jargon, and I think that's actually one of the main hindrances in regards to adoption. Like when I speak to, I don't know if you call them like normies or my friends and stuff like that, or even my family members, and you're trying to explain, oh, this is what a DAO is, this is what this is, this is what that is, and they're all great words, but they do not allow for a
Me.
simplistic viewing and
Yeah.
understanding of what it actually is, because it's not overly complicated. I don't think it is that complicated, but explaining it to people within the words that we naturally use or we use often in the crypto space is actually a bit of an
Right.
issue. Yeah.
Well, it's counterproductive, literally, because you start using those words and people's eyes glaze over and they're like, "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. It sounds sketchy."
For sure.
Whereas if you, again, like the hard work is to recognize how much of this is not new. And this is like where I often tell people, like, there's good, historical work, not just
Yeah.
some nonfiction, even some science fiction is great. Like, if you go read this book, it's called The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. And like it's from, I don't know, the 70s maybe. She's a great science fiction writer, and you like learn about this like world that part of the story takes place in, and it's a like it is remarkable how many parallels there are to sort of the DAO space, and you realize that like actually what we're talking about is, human coordination phenomena that have existed forever, but they change forms. It depends on the context, the communities, what those communities are trying to accomplish, what they're trying to get away from, what new tools are at their disposal, how do they use those tools, but at the end of the day, it's really just like people using concepts, ideas, and tools to organize themselves around some shared desire. And there's always this weird tension between the people who sort of want to, what I'll call, like, change the system or like identify ways to make it better, and people who want to view it as it is, and keep it the same. So like kind of change forces and sameness forces. And the reason I bring that up is because it happens even in crypto, even within a DAO. You'll find the people saying like, no, we decided this, we have to stick to it. At the same time, the other people are going, no, it's really not getting us what we said we were trying to accomplish. Let's try to change it. And like those two groups, even within an otherwise aligned community, are still going to be debating with each other. And that's not bad. You just have to remember that that's actually just part of human organization. You can't, like, no amount of technology is going to remove that like fundamental tension between let's evaluate the thing and change it, and no, it's good, keep it the same, because it's the interaction effect between those two things that actually steers the group.
For sure. I think that was one of the things that I think that has also come up before in regards to even the perspective of what metagame is. And the thing is, in the past we have players and people who contribute to the community, and they had maybe a year or 2 years ago was this, that, and the other, and then this thing is now grown to something totally different, and now the newer participants have a totally different perspective, and they want to push things in maybe a slightly different direction. And like you mentioned there was almost, or there is that tug of war between, okay, well, what is the real ideals? What are the real what's the real direction we're meant to go in as a community? And one thing I found really useful was almost to kind of go back and look at the original frame and perspective which Pep put together in regards to his like initial Medium posts and things like that, to kind of get an idea of what he thought metagame should be from a day one perspective compared to what it is today. And from that framework, I feel like we ended up learning that some of the terminology and some of the parts of metagame we thought would be of great interest aren't really that inspiring. For instance, calling metagame like the onboarding machine for Ethereum, it's like, okay, cool, you're an onboarding machine. Who the hell actually wants to join an onboarding machine? We want to join a cool community. We want to join a place where it's fun to be a part of. There's things